Hello, class. Welcome to the lecture for this week. This one is, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating lectures and topics that we'll be talking about this week, or excuse me, throughout the semester. And in fact, this is one of the most kind of timely topics as well. Um, a lot of what we've done throughout the semester and what we'll continue to do is to better understand the Jewish religion and the Jewish faith. Now, a lot of you will take that information and utilize it in a lot of different ways. Perhaps you're Jewish yourself. Perhaps you're a Christian and you want to understand, some of the early roots of the biblical narratives. Perhaps you're involved in politics and want to understand how Jews fit into the political spectrum. And for those of you that may fall in either wholly or partially into the final category, this lecture will be particularly interesting because without proper context, it's really hard to understand the Israeli-Palestinian-Arab conflict. And so that's the purpose of this lecture, is to understand the cycle of violence, the cycle of opposition and pain that has led to the current situation. And you'll have sufficient context to be able to understand, specifically from the Jewish perspective, where this came from. I'm doing my best to give you an understanding from the Palestinian and Arab perspectives as well, but we have not been studying that all throughout the semester, so I'll do my best. All right, let's launch in. Now, this conflict is essentially like a lot of other geopolitical conflicts. It's a battle over borders, over the size of the state and the borders that make up the state of Israel. And in some ways, it's over whether or not Israel even has the right to have borders or to even have a state itself. So we talked a little bit last week about the beginning of Jewish immigration, but there's a particular part of that narrative that is essential to understand this conflict, and that is the immigration. Now, Mark Twain traveled to the Holy Land in the, I don't remember exactly what year it is, and that's not really germane. But basically, he came back and he wrote a narrative of his travels to the Holy Land, and essentially the idea that came out of it was that, the Holy Land was a land without a people for a people without a land, and that is a reference to the Jews. And so he basically identified it as an unpopulated land for a population that needed a land. Well, that's not entirely accurate. In fact, there were plenty of people throughout the land of Israel and the Palestine, which had been designated Palestine after the Romans destroyed the temple to actually change the attachment to the land of the Jews. They actually called it Palestina, and it was named after the Philistines that lived where the present-day Gaza Strip is, and I'll point that out throughout the lecture. But essentially, that became one of the common sentiments, and I think the Jews understood that sentiment, but it really wasn't very true. There were plenty of Arabs living on the land. Now, there were obviously different parts of the land that were not populated, where the Jews established Tel Aviv and some of the other areas was basically new settlements, and a lot of this was new settlements, but plenty of it was already populated. In fact, what the Jews did when they came in is it wasn't as a conquering force or anything like that, but they came in and they looked up in the Ottoman registries who actually owned the land that they were coming to. And this happened in a lot of instances. Now, hang on, I'm getting an update here. Get rid of that. Okay. So anyways, Jews would find out who the owners of the lands were, and it turns out that in many cases the owners were absentee landowners that lived outside of the Palestinian area. They lived in Syria, Damascus, Cairo, Amman, some of these big cities, Arab cities around. And essentially what had happened is that the local Arabs, the Palestinians that lived on and farmed the land, had transferred ownership to these absentee landowners for purposes of taxes, etc. And then these Arab absentee landowners sold the land to Jewish immigrants out from under the Palestinians. So the Jews come in, and they come in trying to, in a lot of instances, trying to do this legally to actually purchase as much land as they can. And they're buying it not from the people that live on it and that work it, but from the people that actually own it. And then once the Jews own the land, In most cases, the Palestinian immigrant farmers were forced off of the land or basically dismissed off of the land. Because, as we talked about last week, one of the important things about the creation of the state was for the Jews to be able to build it on Jewish labor. Now, Jews had not been able to farm land, they hadn't been able to own land for basically thousands of years, pretty close to that. So it was very important for the Jews to build this on Jewish labor, and they wanted the farms to be farmed by Jews, and that was important. We talked about Aleph Dalet Gordon last week in his emphasis through cultural or through labor Zionism on the Jewish labor concept. So that's how a lot of the conflict started. That's how the Jews came, and that's how the local Palestinians came to be dispossessed. Now, I talked in the introductory email that you have to understand that there's a difference between just calling it the Arab Palestinian or the Arab Israeli conflict or the Palestinian Israeli conflict. You've probably all heard that. I always refer to it as the Arab Palestinian Israeli conflict. Because are Palestinians Arab? Pretty much. I mean, there's a little bit of an argument there. But the bottom line is that these are all different entities and they have different intentions at play, and things that the Arabs do don't necessarily benefit the Palestinians. In fact, in a lot of instances, we see things that Arabs do actually taking an extremely hard stance against Israel, and the Palestinians are the ones that end up kind of more suffering the brunt of Arab decisions. And we'll see multiple examples of that throughout the lecture. So that's an important part of understanding this conflict, is how outside Arabs have acted and basically propping the Palestinians up, holding the Palestinians up as the example of the dispossessed and of the afflicted by the Israelis. But in reality, a lot of Arab decisions have actually been extremely negative for Palestinians and for their benefit. So this is one of those instances of these Arab landowners selling the land out from under the Palestinians, and the Jews legally purchasing the land. Now, as far as border dispute, a lot of what you'll read about and what you'll see when you look at peace proposals and things like that is a distinction between the 1948 borders and the 1967 borders. In 1948 is when the state was established. That's when the 1948 war occurred, and Israel established its borders. So that is the original borders of Israel. And then in 1967, Israel pushed during the Six-Day War. It was a war that lasted only 6 days. And they pushed, we'll talk a little bit more about it, but they pushed into other areas. They expanded their borders. That's when they basically took over the West Bank, where the majority of the Palestinians were. They took over the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, and I'll show you a map here on the next slide. But basically, that's an expanded version of the border. So these peace talks will talk about Israel returning to the 1948 borders versus the 1967 borders, which are currently in. Well, there's been some changes to it, but I'll show you basically. So it's a dispute over borders, and these are key terms: this 48 border, 67 border. Now, this slide looks really weird, but it's because I wanted to blow this map up as large as I could. So in 1947, before war broke out or anything like that, it was obvious that there was conflict in the land because more and more Jews had been coming. This is just after the Holocaust, World War II. We have Jews coming illegally against the policies of the British government, the white paper, because they just ultimately don't have anywhere to go. A lot of other countries have shut off their immigration. The United States instituted immigration reform leading up to this, and so a lot of Jews are arriving here. So this is sort of a powder keg, and everybody knows it. So the United Nations addresses it, and they actually put out in 1947 a partition plan. They proposed 2 states. This is the original two-state proposal plan, and you can see everything in the orange is the Arab state. It's basically where the Palestinians are. It's where they already are located, in and around this area. Up here, leading up into the Galilee, you see even Nazareth, the childhood location and the place where Jesus lived most of his life, the large portion of where the Gaza Strip is, and even coming up along the coast. And Israel, it looks like they have more land, and that looks great, but here's what's called the Negev Desert. This is all desert right here. This is all desert and not very functional for the Jews. But they get this portion along the coast, which is very fertile. This is where Tel Aviv is, and etc. These are a lot of the newer established cities and communities that they put up, and then over here up into this side, up coming up against Syria. So this is not a great state for Israel, and it doesn't accomplish a lot of their goals. It does not give them Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem is the heart of the land of Israel, and we know we've talked about that from previous, classes. Oh, Jerusalem, if I forget thee, and next year in Jerusalem, and all this emphasis. But they do not get Jerusalem in this partition plan. It's actually under UN control, this district, but effectively right smack in the middle of the Arab state. Now, the interesting thing to understand is that this is before any major conflict has taken place. And the Jews readily accept the partition plan. The leadership, through David Ben Gurion, the head of the Labor Party and the head of the Jewish community called the Yishuv, they accept the partition plan, even though it doesn't get them anywhere close to what they want or what they wanted. They were willing to accept these as the solid, solidified borders of the state of Israel. But the Arab League, speaking on behalf of the Palestinians, once again, Arabs from outside making decisions that affect the Arabs that live in this area and are more closely tied to the Jewish communities, the Arab League says no. They handily and readily reject the 1947 partition plan. So the very first attempt to establish a peace, the Arabs say no, and the Palestinians are negatively affected in the sense that they do not get a state. Now, this is before any settlements. Basically, many fewer Jews living throughout here, and no really established settlement push. Basically, it was taking the land where the Jews are, isolating it out, taking the land where the Arabs are, and isolating it out. So this is the first attempt at peace, and it fails largely because the Arabs reject it. Well, entirely because the Arabs reject it. As I talked about before, this is kind of a dispute over land. This is the 1947 partition plan here, you can see. Kind of a recreation of that last slide. This is 1949, and this is kind of like this is what Israel became following the end of the 1948 war. You can see they pushed into a lot of these areas so that the Arab state gets smaller. This part that would have gone to the Palestinian state now is all part of Israel, and the Gaza Strip is just this little tiny spot here. Now, Jews don't really have a historical claim to the Gaza Strip. That's where the Philistines live. And if you remember, the Philistines are referenced throughout the Bible. Goliath, the story of David and Goliath. Goliath is a Philistine, and that famous biblical story. So this is where the Philistines were populated, and never really was part of the ancient land of Israel that was granted to the Jews, per se. And then you see the 1967 borders after Israel fought the Six-Day War. Now I'll give you a very kind of 30-second overview of the Six-Day War. Six-Day War was a preemptive strike from Israel. They actually struck first. But there was actually a buildup along the Israeli border of tanks, planes, etc. from Egypt. So they were staging a war. They were basically flexing their muscles, and Israel, there's some dispute whether Israel truly believed that they would attack, but the bottom line is, any country that builds up its military might right along the border is making a clear statement. So Israel did a preemptive strike. They decimated the Egyptian Air Force with them. I don't even think they got a single plane off the ground, but they were kind of the most powerful Air Force in the Near East area, and they decimated the Air Force. They pushed back against Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and the whole war was over in 6 days. And they had taken over the entire Sinai Peninsula. They had pushed into the Golan Heights right here in Syria, and they had pushed into the West Bank and taken land all up and around the West Bank, even into Jerusalem. You see, they pushed straight through. And as the final talks were taking place to have an armistice in place, Israel was pushing basically up to the very minute to take the city of Jerusalem, which they ultimately did, capturing the old city. So these are the 1967 borders, and these areas are largely conquests of war. Now, Israel didn't annex any of these areas. They basically put them under military occupation, but they did annex area in and around Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, which is all Arab, effectively. They annexed that as a part of Israel because, to their understanding, Jerusalem was an essential part of the state. And at that point, because of the buildup of aggression, there was the justification to fight for their own protection. Because, one of the recurring themes that Israel has is about their own protection because they are surrounded by Arab states on all sides. All right. Now, the war in 1948 created one of the most important to understand parts of the conflict, and that's the Palestinian refugee problem. So in 1948, during the war, there was a plan referred to as Plan D, initiated in March 1948, and that was for the systematic removal of certain Palestinian plans in strategic areas. A lot of people will talk about Plan D being the main cause of the Palestinian refugee problem. That's not entirely true. The Jews weren't just marching into Palestinian areas and driving them out. That wasn't what the plan was. It was for clearing out settlements in areas that were on strategic locations for the war. So maybe a settlement that overlooked Israeli or a Jewish town or something like that would represent an area from which they could attack or something like that, or receive supplies or something like that. So Israel did dismantle and eject several thousand Palestinians during the war through this Plan D. You can see a map here. Well, actually, this shows the refugees. So you see the refugees leaving, some of it from Plan D, but there was another instance, and I should have added this on as a bullet point here, that led to the refugee problem. And that was many Palestinians left voluntarily because, again, they were receiving voices from outside, from the Arab leadership from the outside, telling the Palestinians to leave the state so that the Arab countries could come in and defeat the Jews. That was, this is widely understood, that they said, come and leave so that we can come in and destroy the Jews, and then you can return. So several thousand Palestinians left of their own volition just to get out of a war area. The Jews didn't have the luxury of going anywhere. There was nowhere they could go. But the Palestinians did have the luxury. Many of them had family, friends. Many of the richer, more wealthy Palestinians could afford to leave, and many of them did. They left, and again, the 1948 war, you remember the first year was fought in Palestine just with the Arabs in this area. So the people were already war-torn for a year. And when the outside nations got involved during the second year of the war, this was an opportunity for many of them to leave, to escape the ravages of war, let the combined strength of the Arab military might defeat the Jews, and then they could come back. Well, as you know, that's not what happened, and Israel defeated all these combined Arab forces, and all of a sudden, after the war was over, it sealed all of its borders and did not allow anybody to come back in. So any of the Arabs that were still in these areas effectively became Israeli citizens, and they are the Arab population of Israel. But the Arabs that had left were not allowed back in, and those became the refugees. Now, this is important to understand because there's a lot of different populations involved. There's obviously the Jews, and within the Jews, there's a lot of different socioeconomic as well as ethnic structures between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews from different parts of the world. But here is interesting because now we have what used to be maybe a population that were all the same. Arabs in Lebanon, Iraq, Transjordan, before these were even countries. It was the Ottoman Empire. And they were really largely indistinguishable. Arabs that just lived in different parts of the Arab world. Then all of a sudden, nation states came in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so now they all have these national identities, but are still effectively ethnic Arabs. Now we have the beginnings of a Palestinian people and a distinction within that of Israeli Arabs. Are they truly Palestinians because they're living in Israel? And Palestinian refugees that were no different from the Israeli Arabs, except for the fact that they weren't allowed back into Israel. So now you have all these different peoples. You have the Israeli Arabs, you have the Arabs and Palestinians living in East Jerusalem that have been annexed, but the East Jerusalem Arabs are not given citizenship after the annexation. and then you have the Palestinians that are living in the Palestinian territories, and the Palestinians that are living in the refugee camps. So, very complex situation, and all kind of came as a result of this this war, the 1948 war, and the decision to seal the border. Now, I didn't put the amount of refugees, but they're thought that there was anywhere from um, approaching 1 million refugees. Um, I'm trying to think. I apologize. I can't recall the exact number of the refugees, but effectively, as the refugee camps begin setting up here outside the borders, within a generation or two, are more than 3 million refugees, and now there are approaching 3 to 4 million refugees in these areas surrounding Israel. Um, as the as these refugee camps basically turn into cities, they're cities that are in complete squalor. You can see this; these tent cities that ultimately turn into actual cities. They start to build buildings and things like that, but it's still very much in squalor. Um, and That becomes one of the major issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Palestinian Authority and the leadership want to allow these Palestinians that are refugees to come back into the state, to come back to their original homes. In fact, many of these Palestinian Arabs will still have the keys to their original homes that have already been destroyed and rebuilt by Israelis and whatnot, but they'll have these symbolic keys hanging around their neck that are the key to their home back in the state of Israel. Now it's interesting to understand that right at the same time there was a Jewish refugee problem as well. There were 800. That's what it was. I apologize. So 800,000, approximately 800,000 is Israeli. So all right. Excuse me. So there were Jewish populations in and around the Arab world, um, and in different Arab countries, in Yemen and Iraq and all these areas around. That after the war, these Jewish refugees were Jewish populations that had lived there for hundreds and hundreds of years were kicked out of these Arab lands, forcefully booted out after Israel won the war. And so now there were 800,000, approximately 800,000 Jewish refugees. So a similar number compared to the Palestinian refugees. And the Jews were able to be immediately absorbed, 500,000 plus absorbed directly into Israel. So Israel took these Jews in, and within a generation, they were indistinguishable from anyone else. Because again, Israel at that time is literally a nation of immigrants. So the Jews were absorbed into Israel, and that's why you don't hear of a Jewish refugee problem after the 1948 war, because Israel brought them in. Now, here's another way in which the Arabs may have exacerbated this problem is that the Arab states actually kind of facilitated the creation of these outside tent cities, these refugee camps, when in reality these Palestinians could have been absorbed into these states, and in fact many of them most likely would have taken that opportunity for a better life. But they basically held up these tent cities, and the Arab nations and the Arab states that had representation in the UN were able to hold up these Palestinian tent cities and these horrible refugee cities to try to condemn Israel, and they did that for several years. They used that as an example of humanitarian violations and etc. And basically to further their own end in their opposition to Israel. But the ones that were truly suffering were the Palestinians that were still stuck in these refugee camps without being absorbed into the broader Arab world. Um, so that's one way of looking at it. That's one way of seeing that perhaps the decisions of the Arabs were not thought out in the best interest of the Palestinians, but rather a lot of these Arab nations were thinking based on their own potential benefit in their opposition to the state of Israel. But a lot of these Arab states have the luxury of being able to oppose Israel, and the ones that face the immediate repercussions of that are the Palestinians. And that's you see that recurring throughout the analysis of the problem. And obviously, there's the opposite way of looking at it, that Israel could have allowed these refugees back in from a very early stage, and that would have avoided the refugee camps as well. But Israel is effectively almost in a perpetual state of war against the Arab states and the Palestinians since 1967 on. All right. So another important thing to understand about the conflict is the settlements. After Israel established its borders in 1967, once they basically pushed through and took Jerusalem, they started a very aggressive settlement campaign. So they would move into the West Bank and into Gaza and start building settlements. This was after the Six Day War. Again, this is not land that Israel has annexed. And there's a reason why they didn't annex it. I mean, number one, it might have been significant international opposition to an annexation, but they did annex East Jerusalem. You see right here. So they may have annexed it, but here's the thing. If they annexed it and they chose not to give all these people citizenship, what would be the state of the nation? Israel is a democratic nation. They are they have a parliament. It's called the Knesset, and they elect a prime minister. And they have a president. A president that's more of a symbolic position, but they are a democracy based on representation of the people. So, if they suddenly brought in 5 million Palestinians as citizens, along with the Arabs inside the state of Israel, then the state would effectively no longer be a Jewish state. It would be an Arab state. There would be more Arabs than Jews, and Arabs would control, they would have the majority of the seats in the Knesset, they would have the prime ministership, and it would effectively no longer be a refuge for the Jews. So, this is a question that Israel is still going to have to ask itself, because what currently is happening is that Israel still has the West Bank under military occupation, and they still have Arab Palestinians, Arab Israelis that are citizens within here. And the difference between the Israeli or the Jews and the Arabs is that demographically speaking, the Arabs are having a lot more children and have been for several generations. So the Arab population within Israel is growing faster than the Jewish population. Now, just within the state of Israel, it would take several years for the Arab population to catch up demographically. And the immigration from outside has largely trickled to a halt. All the major waves of immigration have already seemed to happen, even though Israel is still advertising and still wanting immigration because they want to bring more and more Jews into the land to increase kind of the population of Israel and maintain that status as a Jewish state and a refuge for Jews. Um, but if they were to allow annexation of the West Bank or allow that, then the scale would be tipped immediately. If they were to allow refugees from outside, from the refugee camps, to come in back into Israel, the scale would be tipped immediately. So Israel is facing a real crisis of identity. Will it continue to be a Jewish state or will it be a democracy? Because they may not be able to have both for a whole lot longer. They might have to decide at some point if they change the structure of their governance. Now, this is a problem that happened in Lebanon in the 1970s. So Lebanon was largely Christian. They had a Christian population, Maronite Christian, even though they were Arabs. And then the Muslim population started growing a lot faster than the Christian population, and it became clear that the Muslims were going to pass up the Christians, and Lebanon had somewhat of a democratic society, and so that the idea was that they took one final census when they knew that there was a um, Maronite Christian population that was larger than the Arab population, than the Muslim population, and they said this will be the final census we'll ever take, right? And it showed, a majority of Maronites, and so therefore all these government positions that would go to the majority would always go to Maronites. Now, that didn't last very long at all. That led to a civil war. That was one of the reasons for the Lebanese Civil War. And so the question is, if Israel ever tries to do something like that to change their form of governance to make sure that they're always a Jewish state, or build that into a constitution, which Israel does not currently have, or something like that, the question is, how effective will that be if the demographic scales continue to tip and there's more and more Arabs and Palestinians that have influence in the land of Israel? So very, very interesting. Now, getting back to the settlements, Israel pushed after the 1967 war and started building settlements all throughout the Palestinian area. Now, this is important because there are religious claims to these areas that the Jews have. These are the areas of Judea and Samaria, which are important biblical parts of the original state and the original land that was given from God. And so, zealot Jews, basically, ideological Jews, want to come into these areas and reclaim these lands. So they start building settlements all throughout, all the way up to the Jordan. Now, this is a problem because it has the effect of potentially preempting a Palestinian state. How do you build a Palestinian state when it's filled with Jewish immigrants? And also, Jews are living in this Palestinian area now, and so it becomes a great security risk. So Israel, one of their important foundational parts of their society and their protection is that every able-bodied individual will serve in the military for 3 years, and so man or woman. This doesn't apply to the ultra-Orthodox, and it doesn't apply to the Arabs. The Arabs are not allowed to serve in the Israeli Defense Forces, but everyone else is. And a lot of times they get stationed and posted at these settlements throughout here. So Israel feels a compulsion to protect these settlers, and it actually creates more of a military presence in the West Bank and makes it more of a military occupation of these areas, because a lot of the fighting takes place in here as there's conflict between settlers and between native Palestinians. And the Israeli government feels compelled to protect its settlers out here because they're not just going out there on their own. They're going out there with government support, etc. So that becomes a major issue and a major obstacle to the peace process. Here's a graph that shows kind of the increase. You see how many settlements are built here in the 1990s extensively, and this is the public versus private, but a significant amount of public and private settlements and buildings being built. Then you see the 1993 Oslo Peace Accords. We'll talk about those in a minute, and a kind of a decline, and then it kind of kicks back up, and it's kind of all throughout. This only goes up to September 2005, and there's been several settlements built since then. But the bottom line is just to show that throughout the conflict, it's something that never has truly gone away. There's always been, even though there's been different talks throughout the time. They've always been building more and more buildings and kind of trying to reclaim and establish a Jewish presence in the West Bank. Another one of the major issues is Jerusalem, this city that is a prize to all, a prize to Jews, to Arabs and Muslims, to Christians, etc. To the Palestinians, it's important because on the Temple Mount, where the former Jewish temple used to be, is built 2 shrines. There's the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. 2 different shrines. This one that is very recognizable is the Dome of the Rock. That's supposed to be built over the stone where Abraham was commanded to sacrifice Isaac, or from the Muslim tradition, where he was commanded to sacrifice his first son Ishmael, who became the father of the Arab people. Anyways, so where the Jewish temple used to be built are built these long established Muslim mosques. So that creates a major issue right there. A lot of Christians believe that these mosques will have to be destroyed before the next Jewish temple will be built as a part of Christian eschatology and the return of Jesus. So you can imagine the tension that this creates. In fact, there's examples of Christian extremists trying to light a fire in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, trying to burn down the Al-Aqsa Mosque so that the land can be prepared for the building of the temple. Now, one of the reasons why the mosque was built there and why it's so important is that there's a story in the history of Islam that Muhammad, the original prophet of Islam, was whisked away while he was on a journey, taken up by a flying donkey, and whisked away kind of mystically and taken to the furthest mosque, is what it's called, which was basically this area, and it's significant again because of the history of Abraham and Ishmael from the Muslim tradition. And here on the Temple Mount, he had what's called, it's referred to as the night journey because he was whisked through, and then hundreds and hundreds of miles, and he ascended up to heaven, and he spoke with God and saw angels, and that's where a lot of some of the important tenets of Islam came from, was from this conversation with God. the 5 time daily prayer came from this conversation from the night journey, etc. So after that, he was whisked back away, um, and later he was able to tell the people caravans that he had seen along the way, which his people later met up with as kind of proof of his night journey. Um, Now, in addition to the night journey, this land was actually conquered and held by a number of different Islamic empires, one of them being the Ottoman Empire. And there is a tenet in Islam that anytime any land is held by Islamic forces or Islamic civilization, that is Islamic land forever. It's this concept of Dar al Harb versus Dar al Islam. So basically, kind of the land of the infidel, the land of the outside versus the land of Islam. And once a place is held, that is Dar al Islam forever, and it cannot ever revert back to anyone else. So now you have a religious component to this conflict that enters in, that all of this land, all of this area, all these areas on these maps are Dar al Islam. It's land that has been held by the Muslims, and so from the extremist point of view, it can never resort back, and there's never any validity in the Jewish presence in the land because that has once been Islamic land. Then there's this concept of Palestinian nationalism, which is important to understand. At what point did the Palestinian people see themselves as a true nation? That is a huge debate. And, arguments on the Jewish side is that they were no different from the Arabs, so they can be displaced. But the Palestinians themselves, as they create this own national narrative, would start arguing that they saw themselves as distinct for hundreds of years, as different from other Arabs because they were living in and around this holy site and this sacred site. Jerusalem is the third most sacred place in the entire world of Islam. You have Mecca and Medina, in that order being the most sacred, and then Jerusalem, referred to as the furthest mosque. So this question, Israelis or Jews would like to argue that there was no Palestinian nationalism until this whole thing started. Palestinians, even Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the Palestinian organization, the PLO, for a lot of years, Palestinian Liberation Organization, claimed that the Palestinians were the descendants of the earlier tribes that were in the land of Israel even before the Jews came here biblically and were given the land from God. They claim, connection to all of these earlier tribes, and whether or not that's true, I think that's very suspect. But it's basically kind of a claim to try to preempt the biblical claim and the earliest claim of the Jews to the land. This land is important to Israel for various reasons, and we've talked a lot about them. It's their ancient kingdom. They've always talked about it in their liturgy and their rituals. Next year in Jerusalem became a very popular phrase. The biblical promises to the land that they would reclaim it, that God would give it back to them. And then obviously the concept of Zionism, which once it became practical Zionism, political Zionism through Herzl, became a way in which the Jews could actually reclaim the land legally and legitimately as they saw it. So again, Jerusalem is a very hot topic, and when you're talking about the creation of the state, one of the biggest issues is where will Jerusalem fall? Will it if we do a two-state solution, will the Palestinians accept a state that doesn't have some form of Jerusalem as their capital? Because as of right now, Jerusalem is under Israeli control. But will the Palestinians allow that? Will they accept peace with Jerusalem still under Israel's control? Will they accept peace if East Jerusalem is returned to them? This is one thing that some people think Israel did to sort of take Jerusalem off of the table as a bargaining chip. They annexed East Jerusalem and made it a part of Israel, part of the actual borders of Israel, and not a disputed territory under military occupation. But will that be will the Palestinians accept peace under those conditions? Now, an important thing to understand about the old city and the dome and the Temple Mount is that Jews do not go up onto the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is managed by the Waqf Society, which is basically a Muslim society that controls this land up here on the Temple Mount. Here's the Western Wall, and the land up here on the other side is where the old temple was built, this wall being a retaining wall around King Herod's temple. So if you go up onto the Temple Mount, they'll ask you if you're Jewish, and if you are Jewish, you're not supposed to go up there. And one of the arguments from the ultra-religious is that they don't know exactly where the temple was built, and there's a possibility that you could walk into the area where the ancient Holy of Holies was located, where only the high priest was able to go, and that you could inadvertently pass into that sacred space. That's one of the arguments. So as of now, the Muslims, even though this land is controlled by Israel, the Muslims have control over the Temple Mount in that sense that's granted to them by Israel. All right, so I want to talk for a minute. We're kind of wrapping this lecture up here in a moment, but the final status issues was basically issues that were thrown off to the end of the peace process. So the original peace process that started basically was in 1993. This was an attempt to come together in Oslo, Norway, by all sides. The United States were involved, a lot of parties were involved, and it created an actual organization, an actual governmental organization for the Palestinians, which they had not had up to that point. They had had the Palestinian Liberation Organization and other informal organizations that, and then the Arab League, again with Arabs on the outside speaking on behalf of Palestinians, but maybe not having Palestinian, the best concept or intentions for Palestinians in mind. So anyways, the Accords was a coming together and a creation of what's called the PA, the Palestinian Authority, and an agreement to an established peace plan that would take a number of years to implement. And they had these issues that were just so intractable that they had to sort of put them off and say, we can't even talk about these issues until about 10 years. They wanted to establish kind of a little bit more of a rapport with the peace before they talked about the final status issues. And they are basically what we've talked about. The borders, what borders will be used for the states, what will the status of Jerusalem be, the Palestinian refugees, will they be given? The Palestinians have always said that we will not accept peace unless the Palestinians are allowed to return into the land of Israel. And I'm telling you guys, I don't picture a scenario in which Israel ever allows that. So unless one side bends, this is going to be one of those issues that will keep peace from occurring and has kept peace from occurring for decades, unfortunately. Now, a lot of the peace plans that have been proposed, and there have been other plans since the Oslo Accords, have proposed economic remunerations for the Palestinians to pay them basically for the deprivations and whatnot of the refugee situation for the last 70 years. Whether or not Palestinians at some point will get pragmatic and decide that that's the best that they're going to get and take that and negotiate on the amount, I'm not sure. But that is, as some of you know, President Trump has instituted kind of a proposed plan, and that's part of the proposal is economic remunerations for the Palestinian refugee problem. And that's probably all Israel will be willing to do with respect to that. Then there's the question of the Israeli settlements. Does Israel dismantle the settlements that are in the Palestinian state? Because if you look at a map now, and I should have put one on here, but the Palestinian state would effectively look like Swiss cheese. I mean, look at a map in the proposed state that the Trump plan proposes, and you can see how the Palestinian state is connected by highways and tunnels, etc. It's just the weirdest looking state ever. It's in a lot of different areas and whatnot, and it's broken apart by all these different settlements. And there are literally dozens and dozens of hundreds of settlements in these areas, and thousands of settlers. And the thing is, like the Palestinian refugee camps, they're no longer settlements. They're not people camping out in tents and whatnot. These are actually established cities in the West Bank, in these Palestinian lands and territories that have been there for generations now, multi-generations, third generation people being born in these camps, all they've ever known. Not camps, excuse me, in these settlements. So, when you have a settlement that is, a city that is concrete, that has skyscrapers, buildings and whatnot, is Israel really going to come in and dismantle that and bring the Jews back into the internal state of Israel? Most likely not. And so this becomes a real issue. And you can imagine in 1993 this was an issue, and since then hundreds and hundreds of settlements have been built, and thousands of buildings, etc. Now there's one more issue, and there's many more, but there's another really important one that wasn't necessarily one of the final status issues, but it's the idea of water. What will they do about water? Because a lot of the water that Israel gets comes from the mountain aquifer in the West Bank that they tap. And so, will Israel ever be able to give up its military occupation to the land of Israel without the water that it needs to provide for its people? Again, this is in the desert, that they live. And so, that becomes a major issue for the peace process. Will Israel be able to do this and turn this area back over without some sort of water rights from that land that allows them to continue to provide for their people? Now, there's a few other obstacles of peace that I want to identify that have just kind of developed throughout the process. Um, Both sides need to control radical elements. Now, Israel has done a little bit better job of this. I talked about in the last lecture how there were various competing military forces that participated in the war. Well, once the war was over, Israel consolidated all these military forces. The Irgun, the Stern Gang, all came in along with the Haganah, which was the more established military presence, to create the Israeli Defense Forces. In fact, the IDF at the very beginning even fired on a ship that had Irgun. This was very, very open wound in the very beginning of Israel. They fired on a ship that had Irgun militants on there that wanted to sort of continue the violence. And Israel had to do this in order to sort of rein everyone in and create one unified force. That's one thing that, frankly, the Palestinians have never been able to do. They've never had leadership that has been able to rein in the radical elements. You have Hamas, you have the Al-Aqsa Martyrs, a lot of different groups that have engaged in terrorism on the Israelis. And this is one thing that that we'll talk about here in a second, but is a very important part of it too, and explains the mentality of Israel in continuing the military occupation. And that is the terrorism, the bombings, etc. So Palestinians and Yasser Arafat largely. He largely kind of turned a blind eye. And in fact, the PLO for a while was a militant organization. And so Palestinians always sort of had leadership that didn't have the strength or the will to rein in the militant aspects of the society and the radical elements. And without doing that, Israel has almost not even been willing to speak to them to discuss peace when Israeli citizens are at risk of terrorist attacks. We obviously have the ongoing occupation. That is one of the biggest issues when you talk about human rights issues, is that, since 1967, this area has been occupied by a military force effectively, and it shows no signs of really changing. So that is a major obstacle to peace. Again, weak leadership. Israel has had a series of prime ministers, that some of them, they refer to them as hawks and doves. Like, some are more hawkish and more military oriented, and argue about the protection of the state. Some come in on a campaign of peace and trying to create peace with the Palestinians. A lot of times what happens is when one of those is elected and when the peace process fails, usually a hawk swoops in and becomes the prime minister and reinforces Israeli control over the West Bank, etc., for the protection of Israel. So you see kind of this pendulum swinging back and forth. But in Palestine, Palestinians have had leadership that hasn't really been sufficient to raise a national cohesive body and unit that could really engage directly with the Israelis. And I genuinely think that if Palestine had been able to control some of its more radical elements, that there would have been productive peace talks a lot earlier in the process. Another, like I said, is terrorism. This is, suicide bombings, bus bombings. There were two different sort of intifadas or uprising of Palestinians throughout this process that came and went during these peace talks and whatnot. This popular uprising against the Israelis, throwing stones, attacking military convoys, attacking soldiers, etc., sending bombers into Israel to detonate suicide bombs, blowing up buses, etc. A level of terrorism that we in the United States here can't possibly understand, that a lot of these Israelis lived through. And then you have what comes to be sort of a disproportionate response in the violence, because the Palestinians do what they can to initiate kind of these attacks or whatever, and Israel responds in kind, but more so because Israel is a mechanized, military power and has a lot of might, and a lot more Palestinians end up dying in the reprisal attacks that Israel sends back, and it creates a cycle of violence that nobody you can't really even pinpoint where it started. Did it start with terrorism, or did it start before that? Um, so this cycle of violence, but ends up having more of a toll on the Palestinians, more of a human toll, unfortunately, because the Palestinians don't have the same level of you know of military that the Israelis have. But you know, then you put yourself in the Israeli shoes, and you have Palestinians shooting rockets across the border into Israel. What would the United States do if somebody was actually attacking the United States? Our reprisal would be swift and would be severe, and so it just creates this real intractable issue where it's hard to really identify exactly, you know, well, I guess the way of saying it is that no one side is truly at fault, or the main perpetrators of the conflict. Now, some people will tell you differently, but I genuinely believe that you have to understand this in terms of the fault of both sides, because that has to be factored in order to establish a peace, a negotiated peace with both sides. Another important or kind of interesting aspect is this idea of home demolitions. Israel had a process for a while where they would bulldoze homes as a deterrent for terrorism. So if you were a terrorist and you blew yourself up, or you were involved in a terrorist attack, Israel would go bulldoze the homes of your family. And this proved to be a significant deterrent to terrorism. They would send in these reinforced and armored bulldozers that would basically knock down your home. Um, and this was a kind of a draconian policy that was in place, but really had a significant effect in deterring terrorism within the Israeli borders. So hopefully you can see that this is a very complicated issue, and I feel like I've only really scratched the surface. But my goal is that you're a little more confused at the end of this lecture than you were at the beginning. And the thing is you need all the information to be able to understand. You shouldn't just take one side and say, I support the Palestinians, I support Israel because I'm Christian, and this is a biblical prophecy or whatever. You cannot discount the human rights of the Palestinians and the right that they have to have their own governance. You can't just unilaterally support the Palestinians and say Israel doesn't have a right to exist when, Israel was buffeted from nation to nation until Zionism occurred and Israel finally was able to establish a state for itself. So there's arguments on both sides, and you need to see them and then analyze them. And you certainly can come down in one direction and support one particular side in this, if you want to. But I think the most pragmatic approach is to support from the outside. And some of you are more on the inside if you're Jewish or if you're Muslim. But from the outside is to see both sides and to be able to argue for both sides and to be able to support both sides so that there can be a rational argument that takes place for peace. All right, thank you guys. Have a great week.